Thanks, Damien. And what Damien didn't say was that this is my maiden voyage as a speaker on Viking. Please don't break any champagne bottles over my rear end at all. But I hope I give you what you're looking for. Halifax, Nova Scotia. I've never lived in Halifax. However, I've lived for 14 years in one of the neighboring maritime provinces of Prince Edward Island, and for work and for pleasure, I visited Halifax and Nova Scotia many times. And this past year, in fact, our youngest son let us know that he was going on in his education, so he's going to be doing his PhD at Dalhousie University in Halifax in the fall. And so I already realize now I'm going to be there many more times, including, apparently, I've already been told, one time in late August or early September with the car filled with his belongings as we move from Ottawa. But I'm sure many of you have already experienced that. So what are we going to look at today? This is not really a travelogue of sights to see in Halifax. You will see in some of the slides some of the things you might see tomorrow if you're wandering the streets of Halifax. But I wanted to give you something a little bit, in addition to that, a little bit broader. Talks a little bit about Halifax came to be, what its role was or and is within the province, and even in Canada as a whole, and how it's changed, because it's changed dramatically from when it started out as a tiny little military hamlet. So this will be an overview of Halifax and Nova Scotia as well, its major features of development and its role in Canada. And you can see on the slide here, there's two really iconic images that represent both Halifax and Nova Scotia itself. The clock tower, the Citadel Tower, at the base of the fortress, of the Citadel Fortress, and right at the top of George Street. If you've got the energy, it's worth a walk all the way up George Street. And also here, the Blue Nose schooner, the second, the two. Not the original, this is the second one. And for those of you who pick up some change in Halifax tomorrow, if you pick up a dime, you'll see the Blue Nose on the other side of the dime. So, Nova Scotia. For those of you who remember your Latin, Nova Scotia is actually a Latinized name for New Scotland. It's named by Sir William Alexander, a poet and actually a writer, and he was almost a confidant in the inner circle of English King James I. In 1621, James rewarded him for being close, and he gave him sort of a little bit of prize. And that territory, a prize he gave him, was a territory that included what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, as well as Maine. And later, he in fact upped the reward, and he gave him what is now Manhattan, as well as Plymouth. In fact, his agent took a trip down to New Amsterdam and tried to claim the island itself, and he was promptly thrown in jail by the Dutch. Unfortunately, things didn't end up very well for Alexander, and he spent so much of his own personal wealth on fortifications and so on in Nova Scotia. But 8 years later, during one of the many wars between England and France, it was given away again. So it was one of the bargaining chips, the rewards that go back and forth, as so many of the regions in North America and the Americas were during the battles between Britain and France. And he lost all of that. So he came back to England and lost all of his wealth. So I'll point out a couple of things on this map of Nova Scotia here that are particularly important. One of them is, of course, the famous Bay of Fundy that separates New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. If you haven't seen the Bay of Fundy, it's an amazing experience. It's got the highest tides in the world, the difference between low tide and high tide, and there's some wonderful observation places to see the tides going in and out. The other one I want to point out here is Cape Breton Island at the northeast corner of Nova Scotia, part of Nova Scotia. And you can see here the little fort or the label called Louisburg or Louisburg. And that was very important as a fortress, the French fortress of Louisburg. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. but it's still standing, and you can go up there across from Sydney and wander through the fort itself. On the west side of Cape Breton, and Cape Breton has a wonderful history of Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and they're bringing it back in terms of the language and culture. But for those golfers in the audience, it has some wonderful links courses on the west side of there. I know I'd probably go through a box of 12 golf balls within the first hole or two on some of those links courses. The last one I want to point out is the southwest here, and that's the Annapolis area, and that's one of the major wine and apple growing areas of Canada. One last note here on this slide before we go any further, and that is the difference. You've probably heard people talk about the Maritimes and the Atlantic provinces. The Maritimes consist of Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. If you throw in Newfoundland and Labrador, which we'll see the next couple of days, that constitutes the Atlantic provinces, and that's the only difference between the two terms. So let's look at introduction to Halifax here. The original name of Halifax by the Mi'kmaq was Jabukto. In Mi'kmaq, it actually refers to, it's known as the sort of biggest harbor. And it was anglicized by the British and so on as Jabuktu, and then it was changed to Halifax. It changed from Jabukto to Halifax because it was named after George Dunk, who was the Earl of Halifax and the chief lord of trade and plantations. And I think for a moment, aren't the Haligonians, and that's what they call themselves, aren't they happy that they weren't named after Dunk himself? Or we'd be talking about the city of Dunk as opposed to the city of Halifax. Today, Halifax has about 500,000 people. So it's a relatively small city, but that constitutes half of the population of Nova Scotia. And in fact, it actually, in terms of, if you look at it in terms of gross provincial product, or the value of all the goods and services that are produced, it's at least 60% of the economic activity of the province. So it's very important for the province in terms of the population, in terms of the economy and politics and everything else. The origins of Halifax, the original settlers to Halifax, of course, weren't the Europeans. They were the Mi'kmaq. In fact, Mi'kmaq is, if you think of it in an English translation, it translates to my kin friends. When I was a young man, a young boy, we actually pronounced that Micmac, M-I-C-M-A-C. And that was sort of not a very sort of nice way and pronunciation of saying it. The Mi'kmaq themselves pronounce it, or say it as they see up here, M-I-K-M-A-Q, and the last letter is silent, so Mi'kmaq. They settled in the area in about 13,000 years ago. They were a semi-nomadic, as many First Nations tribes were. They were a semi-nomadic tribe, and they actually only came down to the Halifax area in the summer for fishing and hunting, and then they retreated into the interior during the winter months. And in fact, that represents one of the problems that existed in terms of the conflicts between Europeans and many First Nations tribes, but especially here among the Mi'kmaq, and that when the English came over, they had a conception of land ownership that was very different than the semi-nomadic Mi'kmaq and other First Nations tribe. So they felt that, of course, if they weren't permanently settled and staying there 12 months of the year, then you didn't own that property. The area was ceded to Britain by France itself in the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. And it's not, as I said before, it's not uncommon for North American regions to be traded back and forth almost like poker chips, back and forth. I remember I was doing some research on St. Lucia in the Caribbean, and I realized when I counted it up, it had been traded back and forth ownership between the British and French 16 times over the year. So it wasn't uncommon for the crowns of Britain and France to just trade these back and forth depending on who won the most recent war. Halifax itself is an excellent harbor. In fact, it's the second largest harbor, deepwater harbor in the world. Number one is Sydney. You can see here just in terms of this diagram off to the right, In fact, although Halifax Harbor is down here, it goes on to Bedford Basin, and Bedford Basin actually is even deeper than Halifax Harbor itself. It's at least 70 meters, and that's about 80 yards, I guess. And so it's a wonderful place, a protected harbor for ships. And in fact, you'll see a slide coming up later that shows all of the flotilla of World War II ships that were actually in Bedford Basin, or the harbor itself. Very protected from any German U-boats that might have been around. So who actually named and settled and developed Halifax? It's Edward Cornwallis. It was elected by Edward Cornwallis. He was a British colonel, and he had orders by the British Crown to establish British prestige in North America. That's a pretty sort of heady kind of objective to have. He was the first governor of Nova Scotia, and the governor for about 3 years. And at that time, the definition of Nova Scotia included neighboring New Brunswick. He went on, after that 3 years here, he actually went on and did a stint of 15 years as governor of Gibraltar. As was often the case, in order to try to retain control after initial discovery, quote unquote, many European powers tried to encourage their own citizens to settle there. And so Cornwallis gave free land to British settlers who would actually agree to clear the land and start planting crops in it. Unfortunately, in the case of Halifax, it is not a great place to raise crops. It's a glacial till there, there's bog, there's nothing really there, not a great place. In fact, most of Nova Scotia is like this, except for Annapolis down in the southwest. And so, in fact, most of the people that came there, presumably to settle, moved down to the Boston area after the first winter. Right now, we're seeing sort of, and this is a broader issue within Canada, it may even be an issue elsewhere not as well, but we're seeing a recasting of the image of people like Cornwallis, even Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister, and others, in terms of the context in which they were living at the time. And in the case of Cornwallis, you can see his statue is being removed here, and that is largely because of the role that he played in the subjugation of the Mi'kmaq people there. In fact, one of his edicts while he was there was he reward people for the scalps of Mi'kmaq people that were, quote unquote, causing trouble. So the statue was removed in 2018. So unlike other settlements on the east coast of Canada, and especially on the east coast of the northeastern United States, Halifax region was not, as I say, was not very good for agriculture. Although the city plan was laid out, and if you walk around the city tomorrow, it's a grid pattern. It's a very sloped grid pattern, but it is a grid pattern, sort of a layout. But it's primarily created for military purposes, not necessarily for settlement itself. The most early communities in Nova Scotia were actually all the way along the coast of Nova Scotia, these little bays along there. And there was virtually no road network along the interior, along the coast, so most of them were connected by ships, so movement of people and goods and whatever back and forth. There was not much local trade in the interior, and so you can imagine that it was very difficult for communities to actually grow, because many communities grew based upon the trade between their own city and the outlying communities and the agricultural communities around. But there weren't that many agricultural communities and not that many settlers. So the citadel, the fortress itself, you can see it was built here on the top. It was actually built to defend from attacks both by sea and by land. And if you go up to the citadel, you'll see there are cannons still, and they actually do drills of cannon fire throughout the day at the citadel. And I'm trying to remember, because I've been to the citadel several times, and I can't remember now whether they still have the cannons on the landward side. But when it was fully staffed, it was actually, it could defend the city from both sea attacks and from land attacks. The clock tower itself was built in 1801. And it's at, as they say, it's at the top of George Street. And it was built largely both to allow the military, the soldiers, as well as the residents to know what time it is. So I'm going to talk about some of the embarrassing moments and incidents in Halifax's history as well. One of them, prior to the British and Cornwallis, etc., the French had been there for many years. They'd been settling the area right throughout the 1600s. And they had forts in the Bay of Fundy, along the Bay of Fundy. They had forts in Ile St. John. Ile St. John was the French name for Prince Edward Island, of course, before it was turned to renamed Prince Edward Island. And they had forts in Cape Breton, including Louisbourg, eventually. So the British viewed the Acadians, the French Acadians, as a threat because there were so many of them around. And so after the 7 Years' War between Britain and France, and that was 1756 to 1763. By the way, in British North America, they didn't call it the 7 Years' War. It was the War of the French and the Indians. But after the British defeated the French in the 7 Years' War in this mid-1700s, they started to embark on a program to expel the French that were in the region so that they didn't constitute a threat. And so they expelled about 80% of the Acadians that settled there, and that constituted about 11,500 people. And many of them, during that transportation to many different places, either died of disease or starvation. But they were sent down to the 13 colonies. They were sent to France. And interestingly enough, they were sent to Louisiana. Do anybody know what they became when they went to Louisiana? The Cajuns, of course. Of course, so the rich sort of tradition of the Cajuns and the cuisine of the Cajuns owes its existence to the Acadian expulsion from the Maritimes. And then, of course, what the British did is they burned the houses that were left behind, and then they invited the British settlers from New England back up to take over some of that land. Those who stayed, often, there were some Acadians that stayed, and you saw that number of 11,500 or 14,000. They fled into the forest, so they survived somehow. Then after the various battles were over, they started coming back out. And in fact, there's a very rich Acadian tradition in the Maritimes right now, and it really contributes towards the culture and the history of the Maritime provinces. So Halifax, one of the expressions about Halifax is that it grows in war and it declines in peace. And that probably is the case, but there are a lot of things that defy that or that complement that sort of that slogan of growing in war and declining in peace. And I'd like to spend just a couple minutes on what those things are. So the first one, of course, the first factor occurred after the American Revolution. So those people that sided, those settlers in the United States that sided with the British, they weren't viewed very kindly after the end of the American Revolution. And so they came up to Canada, and they were known as the United Empire Loyalists that came up. And they settled right throughout what was to become Canada, British North America at the time, into Upper Canada, which is now Ontario, to Lower Canada, Quebec. By the way, the reason why it's Upper and Lower Canada is really as a function of drainage. So the topography, it drains from Upper Canada down through to Lower Canada. And then many of the Acadians settled in New Brunswick, on Prince Edward Island, and in Nova Scotia as well. And there was estimates that 35 to 40,000 Acadians actually settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, to the extent that eventually, because there were so many, it actually allowed Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to become separate provinces, because there was almost passing a population threshold to allow them to actually have a degree of independence. And it also allowed the growth of the English language and English culture in those places that may have been formerly French culture. This image that you see here on the right is an image of some of the United Empire Loyalists that were seeking refuge in the Canadas. So I want to talk now about sort of the second reason that we can't just go by growing in war, declining in peace, and that is the shipbuilding industry in Nova Scotia. Throughout the early and middle part of the 1800s, Nova Scotia and the ports of Nova Scotia had a very rich and robust tradition of shipbuilding. In fact, it's been estimated that it was the fourth largest shipbuilding region of the world at the time. And they built ships for the British merchant ships, largely. And it seemed as almost every harbor, every port, every community was building these ships. When demand, however, started to drop off for these wooden schooners or these wooden ships that were built, they adapted. The people of Nova Scotia adapted. So rather than just stopping completely, instead of shipbuilding, they then became involved in the trade itself. And they started trading internationally with the ships that they had built. So you start getting this trade up and down the coast of the United States into the Caribbean. So they had traded cotton, they had guano, which is just a fancy word for bird poop, of course, that was used for fertilizer and tea, etc. And they created, and I was trying to find a good slide, but I could not find a good slide for this, a triangular trade that existed from Nova Scotia down to the Caribbean to Europe and back. So salted cod would go down from the Maritimes in Nova Scotia down to the Caribbean, and it would be unloaded, and they would load molasses and sugar and rum, and that would go up to Europe. That would be offloaded, and they would load up manufactured goods and salt, and that would be brought back to Nova Scotia and the Maritimes. So this triangular trade existed. Unfortunately, there are other people that were traded at the same time. And this is part of the slave trade, although not that much of it took place in Canada, partly because the British government outlawed slavery in the 1830s. Still, most of this wasn't concentrated in Canada, but there's still a bit of it, the slave trade. So I want to talk for a few slides now here about the black population that moved back up into Nova Scotia and Halifax and the role that they played. Halifax has a long history of what were referred to at the time as black Acadians. In fact, in the 1791 census of Nova Scotia, almost 10% of the population consisted of black loyalists. These people came from two places. One, where they were refugees from the United States after Britain abolished slavery. So they felt that it was important to come up to escape slavery after Britain abolished it and escape it in the United States and come up to Canada. The second group are actually known as the Maroons. And these were former slaves from Jamaica, more than 500 of them, that were forced to actually leave Jamaica and settle in Halifax in 1796. And this image you see on the right of the map, you see a number of the places where the black loyalists settled in Nova Scotia. The name Maroon was actually from the Spanish word cimarron, meaning wild or runaway slave. So it's immediately, they're being associated with what they did as opposed to what they are as a people. The Maroons themselves actually didn't like it very much in Nova Scotia, and they petitioned the British government to leave, and the British government finally agreed, and 4 years later, a group of Maroons left Britain and actually settled in Sierra Leone in West Africa. I wanted to put this book, two covers of book covers of a book that some of you may have read. And this is written by a Canadian author by the name of Lawrence Hill. And Hill wrote a book in Canada and many other places called The Book of Negroes. I guess the marketing division in the publishing companies felt that was too sensitive. So in the United States, it actually marketed as Someone Knows My Name. And this is an historical fiction. So it's a typical historical fiction. It weaves sort of some true events with some fictitious characters and so on. It actually follows a female heroine by the name of Aminata Diallo, who was captured in Africa in 1754 and sent to the United States. She was granted her freedom by the British and British Crown, and she was tasked with writing the names of all of the black United Empire Loyalists and so on who were going to move up to Canada. She was a free person, as were the rest of them, because slavery didn't exist officially, but unofficially there was a lot of discrimination they faced. She also, although I'll be talking about the community of Africville in Halifax in the next slide, she did not, in the book, she did not go to Africville. She went to a tiny community on the south tip of Nova Scotia called Birchmount. So she takes up the offer. She writes the names in the ledger, and the ledger then becomes the Book of Negroes. She was in the book. She was one of the people that took up the offer to go to Sierra Leone. Now, in reality, and there's a bit of license that takes place here. In reality, there probably wasn't an individual who was hired to do this. And in fact, the story is that the British Crown, they took fairly meticulous records, and they were the ones that created the book of the 3,000 the black loyalists who came up here. But it's a great story nonetheless if you get a chance to read it. So throughout the 19th century, the blacks in Halifax formed a very rich, vibrant community. In fact, that community existed for about 120 years. And it was also a source of very cheap labor, and it was the high level of discrimination against them in the Halifax area. This image you can see on the lower left, I've got a red arrow on it, pointing towards the little neighborhood of the community of Africville. And that's sort of at the northern tip of Halifax here, right across from where is currently the McKay Bridge, and it separates what is Halifax to, on the other side, the other community of Dartmouth. So as I say, it was a very close-knit community. Unfortunately, or maybe because of it, they suffered a lot of deprivation. So they had very little in terms of septic system, very little in terms of clean water. Fire and police service was almost non-existent. And if that wasn't enough, the Halifax fathers, in their wisdom, decided that they should also put located the prison, a slaughterhouse, an infectious disease hospital near the community, and then they put the town dump right near the church. So eventually, they were wondering, the town fathers wondered, well, why is it that there's so much poverty in this village? We better just demolish all of this village and actually relocate the people that are there. Now, if they'd actually spent some money providing the services, it probably wouldn't have been that poverty, but they did demolish all of the houses. They gave minimal compensation to the people that lived there, and they relocated them sort of elsewhere. So this forced relocation is now sort of a black spot, has been a black spot on the history of Halifax. They've tried to make sort of some type of retribution in terms of some compensation in terms of the history, and there's a community church there that exists now. But it is a chapter in the life of Halifax that a lot of people probably aren't very proud of. One more person I want to mention here as well, and that is a woman by the name of Viola Desmond. Viola Desmond was born in 1914. Remember that date, 1914, by the way, when we talk in our next slide or two, because it'll be an important date. She was born in 1914 in Halifax, and she was trained as a beautician. She wasn't trained in Halifax because of her race, so she actually had most of her training as a beautician in Montreal, Atlantic City, and in New York. But she came back to Halifax to open up a beautician shop, and she specialized in providing skincare for black women, and also created a training school for black women so they could go on and become beauticians as well. Well, Viola Desmond was traveling in one of the smaller communities in New Glasgow between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. She decided to go to a movie theater. Now, although slavery had been abolished many years before this, there was still a lot of informal discrimination that was going on. And in this movie theater, that was one place that existed. And it was understood that whites were in the main floor of the theater, and blacks were supposed to be up in the balcony. And there was a difference in price for the tickets between the two. So Viola bought her ticket and just proceeded to sit in the main area, not knowing that this was something that she wasn't expected to do. So she was told that she had to leave that section. She volunteered to pay the higher fee to sit up in the balcony, but they wouldn't allow her to do that, and they actually charged her. Now, they couldn't charge her, obviously, with sitting in a white-only area. So believe it or not, they charged her with tax evasion. And the difference between the fee for the main floor and the balcony was 1 cent. So they charged her with tax evasion for the difference of 1 cent. And she was given a $26 fine for that charge. And in fact, she appealed it, and she had support from various places for an appeal, but she lost the appeal. And she left Halifax. She lived for a period of time in Montreal, and then went to New York, and then died in New York. Posthumously, she was pardoned in 2010. And if you are in Halifax tomorrow and you happen to spend some money, if you get a $10 bill, you'll see Viola Desmond's picture on the $10 bill, on the back of the $10 bill. On the other side is sort of the Museum of Human Rights that exists in Winnipeg right now. So another important event in the history of Halifax. Remember I told you that date, 1914? So 1917, 3 years after Viola Desmond was born and lived in Africville, there was a major explosion in Halifax. She survived, obviously, the explosion, but this is one of the most important events in Halifax's history. Happened during World War I, and it occurred when the French ship, the SS Mount Blanc, carrying very flammable munitions that were destined to Bordeaux, France, collided with the SS Imo from Norway. And the Norwegian ship was carrying some relief supplies once again to Europe. Unfortunately, the Mount Blanc caught fire and started to drift towards Pier 6 in Halifax. Now, as you might imagine, given the general nature of people, a lot of the residents of Halifax came out of their houses to watch the fire. And they probably were wondering why all the crew members were jumping overboard and swimming as fast as they possibly could away from the ship. Because when the ship actually exploded, it actually was enough of an explosion that it leveled everything within half a mile of the ship itself. And it factly damaged buildings within 2 miles beyond that as well. There were 1,742 people that were killed and 9,000 people that were injured in that explosion. And it's suggested now that it was the largest human-caused explosion in the world up to that point in time. Got to hear 2.9 kilotons, equivalent to 2.9 kilotons of TNT. That image on the left-hand side here is a part of a shaft of an anchor, and that was hurled 2.3 miles away from the explosion. This building you see on the right is actually along the waterfront. If you're walking along there, you might see that building. This is the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, and every December 6th they have a ceremony to acknowledge the people that died in the explosion. Anybody here from the Boston area? Anybody from the Boston area? No? Well, this next one, every year as thanks for the people of the city of Boston, who donated medical supplies and relief supplies after the explosion to the Halifax area, the people of Halifax and Nova Scotia cut down and donate a Christmas tree to Boston. And so it's put in the Boston Common and lit every year in acknowledgement of the help that they paid, the help that they gave during it. So let's go back to this thing about Halifax growing in fits and starts and growths and decline. The provincial railroad was built in Halifax to connect Halifax up with the rest of the area and the rest of Canada in the 1860s. And it reinforced Halifax dominance in Nova Scotia because it was almost like a hub and spoke kind of system where everything was focused on Halifax. The other thing that became important was the growth of homemade entrepreneurs and capitalists here. And so some of you might know the name of Samuel Kennard, who established the Kennard steamship lines in there. He was born in Halifax and grew up in Halifax. And he actually, the Kennard lines, built the ship of the Britannia. They built the Queen Mary and they built the Queen Elizabeth. The other family that still exists, and the company corporation is worth over $10 billion now in the maritime area, is the Irving family. And the Irving family started in lumber in the 19th century, in lumber and pulp and paper. They went on then to shipbuilding, as well as oil and gas, and they're involved in some of the military contracts to build frigates and Coast Guard cutters in the Halifax area for the Canadian government. I mentioned that flotilla. Here's one of the flotillas in the Bedford Basin. Halifax population during World War II doubled from 70,000 to 130,000, and they were a repair facility for Allied ships. And it's estimated, and I've got the number here, that 7,142 Allied ships were repaired in and around the Halifax area. So after World War II, a recession followed inevitably because there was that build-up with the war and a recession followed. I want to give you this quote by Nader. He said, "Throughout its history, indeed, Halifax has been more dependent on national and global affairs than on serving as a hinterland with a typical range of urban services." And that goes into the theme in terms of that development of Halifax. So we have another era then in the early 20th century that really saw the growth of the entire Nova Scotia coastal region. In the early 20th century, you see the rise of commercial deep-sea fishing. And this isn't inshore fishing. This is for off of the Grand Banks, 100 miles out from the shores of Nova Scotia. So you see the construction of all of these fleets of schooners that are going out and trying to capture the cod, especially off to the Grand Banks. And you can see this image, this painting on the right-hand side here of many of the dories that would be stored on the schooners, and then they'd be shipped off to the side, and that's how they'd get the fish, the cod. Often it's for jigging and other ways to get the cod and bring them back that way. These schooners also carried produce along the communities of Nova Scotia and then up and down the coast itself. In fact, even during Prohibition, the schooners were known to carry rum up and down and try to circumvent the American authorities during the Prohibition era. The schooners were very seaworthy, they were very speedy, and they were really the workforce of the fleet that existed there. They had to be very fast. You wonder, well, why do they need to be so fast? They had to be fast because the fastest ships bringing the fish back to the harbor got the best prices for the best price for the ships, for the fish. So after doing this for a while, as you can imagine, there was a fierce competition that emerged, especially between Canadian and American schooner owners. And so a competition emerged called the International Fisherman's Trophy. And unlike the America's Cup, this was a competition between tough working class sailors from the various, and these are the working sailors on the ships themselves. So this is where the famous Blue Nose that was created in 1921, you see an image of it there on the left, was created. And it's called the Blue Nose because it was named for the nickname for Nova Scotians. They were referred to as Blue Nosers. The Blue Nose won 17 races in a row, and it was also holds the record for the greatest number of fish, the largest fish landing in the town of Lunenburg, and some of you might be going to Lunenburg tomorrow on this. It was called the Queen of the North Atlantic. In fact, it also made its way up the Great Lakes and was displayed at the Chicago Fair in 1933. and it made it across the Atlantic and celebrated King George's Silver Jubilee in 1935. Unfortunately, it didn't have a great ending. In 1942, it was sold to some interests in the Caribbean, and it was used to transport rum and sugar and molasses in the Caribbean, and it ran aground on a reef in 1946 and sank. Fortunately, and it's about this time that anyway, as you can imagine, the mechanized fishing trawlers are starting to take over from the schooner. So the age of the schooner was almost dying at this time. But this is such a symbolic, has such a symbolic importance to Nova Scotia and Canada that the Nova Scotia government commissioned and built a replica of it, the Bluenose 2. And it was actually the first voyage of the Bluenose 2. You can see the Captain Walter sitting here with the trophy beside him. He was the captain of the Bluenose. He lived long enough to sail on the maiden voyage of the Bluenose 2. And the Bluenose 2 was actually then refurbished once again to great expense, and it was launched once again in 2015. I don't know if it's at Lunenburg. That's its home base, but it actually travels in many different places. I'm not sure whether. I hope it's there tomorrow for those of you who see that go to Lunenburg, but it's based out of Lunenburg. So let's look now at the rise of Halifax banking. Banking, it followed sort of Confederation in 1867. 3 of the 5 main banks in Canada were from the Halifax area. And you can imagine at the time with international trade, industrialization taking place, this was an important part for banking. This image on the left-hand side here you can see is above the original Bank of Nova Scotia, or Scotia Bank, in Halifax. And you can see in the top of this is the wooden ship, the William D. Lawrence, and that's the largest wooden ship that was ever built in Canada. In the middle of that carved image is a cod, and in the bottom is a sheaf of wheat and a plow. Well, almost all of those banks, in fact, all of those banks that started in Halifax moved to Toronto around 1900. You can see here the logos of the Royal Bank of Canada, the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, and the Bank of Nova Scotia that was rebranded the Scotia Bank. And they moved for lots of reasons. The main reason that they moved is that the population center of Canada was moving from the East Coast towards Ontario and Montreal area. So that's where all the that's where the people were settling. And so that was the center of control, the center of finance at that point. And it was becoming very expensive then to ship manufactured products from the East Coast back there. So it actually had seen its heyday. I won't spend long on this, but I just want to mention this because it actually reflects, this diagram reflects sort of the development in Canada, this core, periphery, heartland, hinterland model that's often talked about in economic geography and other places. And the core regions are those that have the haves, and the peripheries are the have-nots. The have-nots provide labor, they provide resources, etc. And the cores are the centers of population, political power, control the economy as well. And of course in Canada, the core of Canada is that corridor from Quebec City right down to Windsor, and especially including Ottawa. And then there's a golden horseshoe. You can't see it here, but it's from Toronto right around the western end of Lake Ontario into St. Catharines and Niagara Falls, referred to as the golden horseshoe. The periphery, of course, in Canada was Atlantic Canada, the prairies, and the north. There are some mini cores as well, so you can think about Alberta and Calgary and Edmonton as a mini core, and the Vancouver lowland, the mainland lowland, is probably another mini core. So a couple last slides before I let you go. One is, well, where is Halifax now in the 21st century? It's actually a very vibrant place. It's rediscovered itself. There's still a lot of government-based employment and financing, et cetera, in terms of the defense spending, the Navy, the Coast Guard, shipbuilding. And there's still some offshore oil that brings in revenue. But there's, to a much greater degree, there's a lot of knowledge-based activities going on, and a lot of tourism, and a lot of creative culture that takes place that generates the economy too. It's home to 7 universities and 3 community colleges, and it has about 40,000 students annually. And think of that in relationship to the population of Halifax. There are also pockets of high tech, like Dalhousie University's cluster in the life sciences and the oceans. Believe it or not, Nova Scotia also has, or will have, a space launching pad that is being built just on the edge of between Cape Breton Island and Nova Scotia. And up until recently, they had a focus on skilled labor. And so that the skilled labor coming into Nova Scotia compensated for many of the youth that actually moved to Alberta and Ontario to take better paying jobs there. And as you can see on the left side here, there's a lot of aspects of tourism that attract people, including ourselves. So one last slide I want to leave you with, and because that in parentheses my title said, well, what about St. John's? And I don't know whether there's anybody from from Newfoundland and Labrador in the area, but in fact, that's another major metropolis in Canada. We're going to be steaming past it on the way up to Lansdowne Meadows. Now, why is it that St. John's is not the eastern metropolis of Canada? Well, partly Newfoundland didn't join Confederation until the 1940s, and so Halifax had a much longer start there. And you can, if you think about the isolation of Halifax itself, imagine the isolation of St. John's trying to get products and services elsewhere. There's a very rich oil industry, but Newfoundland still suffers the booms and busts of resource-based economies. In fact, that's the title of my next talk, is the booms and busts of Newfoundland and Labrador. So I'm going to end right there. I'm going to talk much more about Newfoundland in, I guess it's not tomorrow, but the next day at 3 o'clock in this room. So if you want to hear more about Newfoundland after your visit to Lansdowne Meadows, I hope you're going to come and see the talk. And I appreciate being such an attentive audience. I'm not going to take questions here, but I'm going to go back to the bar. I'm not going to order a drink at the bar, but I'm there to take questions if you want to stay for a few minutes. Thank you very much.